Hello, in this lecture we will be looking at Chapter 20, Late Medieval and Early Renaissance in Northern Europe. So what you need to do to help keep yourself organized is for each chapter we're looking at, we are usually looking at a specific time period and a specific place. So last week in Chapter 14, remember we were looking at the Duecento and the Trecento in Italy. So here what we're looking at the 15th century, which is going to be 1400 to 1499, and we're mainly looking in the area of what is known as Flanders, and you could see that on the map here near the upper left hand. Flanders is what is today known as Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and part of northern France. And in this area at this time, you had widespread prosperity. And in times when we have great prosperity, usually we have more art being produced and more art being bought. And if you think about this, logically this makes sense because when we're in times of war or times of hardship, people are more concerned about getting the basic human necessities, right? Food, water, shelter, and clothing, and making sure that their families are safe and secure. So in this area, though, it's a time of peace and it is a time of economic prosperity, so we see more art being purchased. And what we're also going to see is from the last couple centuries, we're also going to see more art being purchased by the church, but we're also going to see those outside the church. So the guilds, which we will talk about, royalty, and then eventually we're going to start having the rise of a merchant class or a middle class, and we are going to see them purchasing a lot of art. Also at this time period, we have a very, very important invention, and this is the invention of oil-based paints, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Also at this time, portrait painting became very popular again. And some of the reasons for this was it was a way of showing wealth and importance, and this also was important for the artists themselves because portrait painting became a major source of income for the artists. All right, so some things that are happening in Northern Europe at this time. This is not necessarily in Flanders, but we have the Great Schism continuing. And this was where we had the competition between the different popes. We talked about where the popes who had usually been in Rome had moved to Avignon. And there was the idea that no, Rome is the seat of the church. The popes need to be back. A pope wouldn't leave Avignon, so they elected another pope to be in Rome. So you had two competing popes. And then the idea was, okay, well, to solve it, we'll just elect a third pope. So at one time, you have three different men who are claiming to be the head of the Catholic Church. And of course, this caused great confusion and turmoil. Also in Europe, we have the 100 Years' War continuing. This was from 1337 to 1453, and this was a very long war fought between France and England. Now, also at this time, economically, feudalism is on the decline. Feudalism was where you had a lord who would own the land, and what the lord would do was it would allow the peasants or the serfs to come and work the land, and then yet they would have to give a portion of it back to the lord. And what we're going to start seeing at this time, we do have kings and queens, but they didn't have very strong centralized royal governments. Well, we're now going to see this start to shift, and we're going to start to see these centralized royal governments become more powerful. And then we're also going to begin to see the early stages of capitalism within Europe. All right, so for this first section, we are going to focus on the artwork of Burgundy and Flanders. And here what we're going to see is many of the artworks are still going to have religious themes and goals, but many of them are also going to have some sort of political and or social meaning behind them. The first work that we're looking at here, this is Melchior Bordelum. He was active 1387 to 1409. And these are the exterior panels of the main altarpiece for the chapel at Chartreuse. This was commissioned by Philip the Bold. And remember, we've talked about altarpieces. Altarpieces would serve as the backdrop for Mass. Now, what we're looking at here, these are the exterior panels. So this is actually the altarpiece closed. And what we see here on this is the this actually shows 4 different religious scenes. If you look on the left panel, we have the Annunciation and the Visitation. And on the right panel, we have the presentation in the temple and the flight into Egypt. And so here, as we follow it from left to right, we see various different times. Now, some scholars believe that on the left represents the Old Testament and the right is the New Testament. On the left, it's because these events happened before the birth of Jesus. And some scholars actually claim because the architecture in here is older architecture. If you look in the back, you'll see the rotunda, and this is characteristic of the Romanesque architecture. Now, the panel on the right has events that takes place after the birth of Jesus, and then the architecture here is very different. It's more Gothic, and so this is supposed to show a change in time. Also interesting here, on each panel you have a scene that takes place inside and a scene that takes place outside. Now this helps to show the viewer that these are different scenes taking place. And we have to remember, a lot of these altarpieces, part of their purpose was education, to tell the stories, because we have to remember that most people at this time were still illiterate. All right, couple interesting things. If you look on the right-hand panel where there's the flight into Egypt, there's actually a Greco-Roman or a pagan god on top of a column, and it's actually falling off, and you see this as the Holy Family approaches. And we still see some of these effects that we saw in last week's chapter. We're seeing more of a strive towards naturalism within the works. Here we see some attempts at using linear perspective and atmospheric perspective to represent three-dimensionality. The individuals in here look much more individualistic. They have their own characters. And then we're going to see the use of these details to add, again, a realness to the work. Now, this work, unlike other ones that we've looked at, are very, very bold, bright colors. And that is possible through the invention of the oil paints. And here we'll kind of depart a little bit and talk about the development of oil paints. Up until this time, tempera had been the preferred medium. Tempera is usually an egg combined with a wet paste of ground pigment. The pigment is the color. When you use this, it has a very velvety sheen once it dries. Now, it is very durable. In fact, when we look at ancient Egyptian works, most of those were created using tempera. But tempera dries very, very quickly, and because of this, it's very hard to rework. Usually, it's a thinner medium, so we do have clear, crisp, clean lines, and very rarely do we see visible brushstrokes in the work. And part of that is also, if it is applied too thickly, it actually results in cracking and flaking off, and it destroys the work itself. Well, what happens in Flanders is we have the development of oil paints. And what oil paints are, it's powdered pigments mixed with linseed oil. And the thickness of the paint depends on how much oil is added. Now, oil paints dry much slower, and I'm talking very slow. And so because of this, they can actually be reworked, and artists can actually blend colors on the work themselves. Also, with oil paints, you have a greater variety in colors, and because of this, we have these bold, bright colors, and we have what's called the sfumato, which is a smoky effect, and that's made possible. Also, oil paints can dry very flat and smooth. They naturally reflect natural light, and they can be applied to various surfaces. First, wood panels are used, but as we're going to see later on, canvases are going to become the preferred medium of the artist. All right, well, then moving on, this is Robert Camden, circa 1375 to 1444, and he was also called the Master of Flamel, and he's considered the greatest Flemish painter of the time. And here we're looking at his most famous work. This is the Marode Altarpiece. And the date's on this 1425 to 1428, and it is an oil on wood. Now, this is actually a small altarpiece that was produced for a private patron. And so the use of this would be intended to be used in the household for household prayer. And what we're seeing here is kind of an integration of religious and secular concerns, because here we still have the religious theme. If we look in the middle panel, we see again the Annunciation. On the right-hand panel, we see Joseph in his workroom, but on the left-hand panel, we actually see the donors, meaning those who paid for it. They are on the left, kneeling in prayer, and they are literally watching this event. Their names are Engelbert Mecklin and his wife, Marguerite Skrinmakers. And this work is also very, very full of religious symbolism. If you look on the bench that Mary is kind of leaning on, the finials, you see there are lions on one side, and the lions are symbolisms of watchfulness in Jesus and his resurrection. The other side, we see two dog finials. Dogs, as we talked about before, show fidelity and domesticity. There is a candle on the table, and this represents the light of the world brought by Jesus. Also on the table, there is the lily, which is a symbol of Mary, and it represents purity. And then, very interesting, if you look in that center panel, coming flying in through the windows, there's actually a little baby tiny Jesus, and he's carrying a cross. And if you follow the line, it actually is going to go right towards that bright spot on Mary's lap. And here we have literally the pre-Jesus coming in, because remember, the Annunciation is the moment where Gabriel, the angel, tells Mary that she's going to have the Son of God. And then also interesting, in the right panel where Joseph is in his workshop, and he's constructing two different mouse traps. And the idea is that this is symbolic of the theological concept that Christ is going to be the bait set in the trap of the world with the idea of catching the devil. Now we also see in here different secular things. So within this, what's pictured are the accessories, furnitures, and utensils that would commonly be used in Flanders at this time. Also, when you look out the window on the right panel, the skyline of the city shows typical Flemish architecture. So what's happening here, what Camden is doing, is he's actually placing us in time and place. A viewer at this time would be able to look at this and know where it's taking place. And again, the donors on the left witnessing the event. The reason the donors are in this work is to show that they are actually the ones that purchased this. And part of the idea is it's supposed to show their own holiness and devoutness. Interestingly enough, the donor's last name, the male's is Engelbrecht, which means angel bringer, and Skrinmakers, her maiden name, means cabinet or shrine makers. Also within this, we're going to see again the use of oil paint to help us create these bold, vivid, bright colors, lots of clear, crisp details in the work, and we're still going to see these attempts at three-dimensionality. He doesn't do the greatest job. If we look at the bench, there's a little bit of perspective issues here, but again, we see these attempts at three-dimensionality. Each of the figures in here are very individualistic, and we see a lot of this use of natural light to make things appear more natural or realistic. All right, now we're going to look by various works by Jan van Eyck, circa 1395 to 1441. Now, Van Eyck was the court painter of Philip the Good, who was the Duke of Burgundy. And what we're looking at here, this is the Ghent Altarpiece, 1423 to 1432, and it's an oil on wood. Interestingly enough, this piece was actually started by Jan van Eyck's older brother Hubert, who died in 1426. It was commissioned by Jacques Vid, who was a diplomat for Philip, and his wife Elizabeth Berlot. Now, this is a very large piece. It's nearly 12 feet tall, and it was actually one of the largest altarpieces in this area in the 15th century. And this is the centerpiece for the chapel within the Ghent church. Now here there's actually two images. The one on the lower right are the exterior panels, and so this is what it looks like when they're closed. Here we can clearly see the patrons, the donors, kneeling in prayer on the bottom panels. And then the entire altarpiece amplifies the central theme of salvation. The altarpiece celebrates the whole Christian cycle from the fall of man to the redemption, and it presents the church as triumphant in heavenly Jerusalem. Again, we see with the use of the oil paints, these very bold colors, very clear details, and this use of texture in the work, all to make it appear much more lifelike. All right, this next work is the Arnolfini marriage, or Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride. It's 1434 oil on wood. Now this work is very important because what happens here, again with the oil paint, we see this that Van Eyck uses, he's able to achieve this three-dimensionality through the subtle color and blending and softening of shadows. Here, the light naturally comes from a realistic source. It comes from the window that we see in the back. Now what's interesting here is the two people depicted are Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride. And what is taking place here, most scholars agree that this is actually the wedding taking place. And no, she is not pregnant. This is actually just the fashion of the time. In fact, women would pad their abdomen and they would even slouch so that they would have this posture because that's what was considered in fashion. And what is shown here is the Arnolfinis are part of this rising merchant class, meaning as time, trade, and exploration continues, you have this demand for goods from other parts of the world in Europe. And so that's where the merchants develop. They are the ones who send their ships, get the goods, bring them back, and then sell them. And that's how Arnolfini got his wealth. So this portrait does a couple different things. It helps establish the wealth of Arnolfini and his wife because, number one, portrait work at this time is only being commissioned by the wealthy, and through here there are different objects that are very purposely placed that show the wealth of the subjects. So different things that show this. First, we can look at their clothing. The clothing, we can tell from the details, very rich, thick fabrics. His cloak, we can see that it is fur-lined. The details on her dress, especially in the lower right, you can clearly see all of this detailed work, which would be very expensive. Also in the background, we see the red canopy bed. Now, some people think, okay, canopy bed, so we must be in their bedroom. We actually are not. At this time, having a canopy bed was a sign of prestige, sign of wealth, kind of like, hey, you made it, you have a canopy bed. So what people would do, so others could see they had the canopy bed, was they would actually put it in their living room. And so that's, again, why we see that there. If you look in the left in the window and just below the windowsill, we see there are oranges. These are something that would be very hard to get and expensive. And it also shows this idea of travel and trade. The chandelier that is depicted, this is very ornate, and so this would be something that was very costly. The shoes in the bottom left foreground, again showing travel and trade. And then we have the dog also in the portrait, and the dog is facing her. And we've mentioned before, usually when we have a dog in a painting, especially with a woman, it represents loyalty and fidelity. And then in the back on the wall, we also see this very ornate mirror. So again, that shows wealth, but even more interesting in the mirror, we have what's called a double portrait. So Van Eyck is painting, and he's painting what he sees, including the reflection in the mirror. So if you zoom in and look at it, you actually see the backs of the Arnolfinis, but you actually see the artist himself is reflected in the mirror. And this is very important because this shows for the first time in history that the artist became the perfect eyewitness in the truest sense of the term. He is literally showing that he is there witnessing this event. And if this is a marriage, witnesses are required. I mean, we still require witnesses to be at a marriage today. And then this is a shift in the changing role of the artist. That artists are no longer just seen as the technician, as the skilled craftsperson who is doing it, but they're actually part of the events that are going on. And so that's why it's very important that we see Van Eyck here. Then, if we want to take it even further, if you look above the mirror on the wall, there is actually writing. And this translates to Jan van Eyck was here. He literally makes a statement that I was here. That way the viewer has no choice but to recognize that he is literally part of the artwork. All right, we see some of this continued in this work also by Jan van Eyck. This is Man in a Red Turban, 1433, oil on wood. Now this, most people believe the man is Van Eyck and that this was a self-portrait where he looked at himself in a mirror. Again, because the oil paints, we see very clear, detailed, natural shading of the work. And so what's interesting here is that the object, the man in the painting, is actually looking directly back at the viewer. No matter where you go, his eyes tend to follow you. And this is actually the first known Western portrait in over 1,000 years where the sitter does this. And so this is very groundbreaking because when we look at this, we can't just look at the man as an object in the painting. When he looks at you, right, it's like the same as when you look in somebody else's eyes. You have to then see them as a subject, as a person. Also, what's interesting in this is the frame is actually part of the work itself, and Van Eyck wrote on the frame. It very clearly states along the bottom, Jan van Eyck made me, and then the date it was painted on, October 21st, 1433. And then in the top, in Greek letters, we see the phrase, as I can. Now, some art historians believe this was almost an advertisement of Van Eyck's skills to show how skilled he was as a painter. Because if you're doing portraiture work, right, you want to be shown how you are. Well, Van Eyck literally created a portrait of himself and said, this is me as I can, and this is how good I am. I can create this. And so it's almost a piece of advertising for him. All right, next we're going to move on to a work that's a little bit different. This is Roger van der Weiden. He was actually an assistant in the workshop of Robert Camden, and Van der Weiden was known for his dynamic composition stressing human action. Usually his works would concentrate on Christian themes, and we see that in the work here. This is the Deposition, 1435 to 1442. It's an oil on wood. Now this is the center panel of a triptych. Triptych meaning there are 3 different paintings. This was commissioned by the Archers Guild of Louvain for the Church of Notre Dame of Our Lady the Virgin. Here again, we see this very realistic detail in the clothing, in the individuals of the faces. Yet what makes this seem different is it seems contained in this very small space. It's almost as if the characters here are contained within this small box, which makes it unrealistic. The moment that is being shown is a very religious scene. This is the moment where Christ is being taken down from the cross. And if you look at the body of Jesus and look at the cross itself. This is unrealistic. Like, that body could not hang on that cross. That cross is much too small. Also very interesting is the line of the body. Traditionally, we've seen very strong horizontals and verticals, but here the form is much more curving. It's much more diagonal, which gives it more of a lifelike feel to it. And then if we look below him in blue, we've seen that this has been too much for Mary, and she is actually fainted. And if you look, her form actually reflects that of Jesus. And the idea is that it reflects one of the beliefs that Mary suffered the same pain at the crucifixion as her son did. But again, we do see very, very clear and minute details. And this is all done to show the emotion of the individuals, the sorrow and the anguish of this moment. Also very interesting, he did pay a little bit of homage to the Archers Guild that commissioned the work, because if you look in the upper left-hand and right-hand corners, you can see this decorative work. Well, if you look, you can actually see a bow and arrow as part of this. All right, well, what we're going to look at here, this is going to be a discussion of another one of those little kind of sidebars in the textbook, and it's where it talks about art and society and the artist professions in Flanders. And it's important to understand this because this is how people would get training, and then how they would actually become, if you want to say, like even licensed or respected as an artist. And so what we have is we have guilds who control the artistic production in Flanders, much like they did in Italy. And so guilds are these group of individuals who come over or come together and focus on one specific subject matter. So the Archers Guild, obviously focusing on archery. Also, the guilds would include the training for young men. And you can read this in detail in your text, but usually what would happen is the young man would be sent off to train or apprentice with a well-known established artist, and they would actually go and live there. Once their training was done, they would usually work in the artist's workshop for a time before trying to strike out on their own. Now, because of this, there are actually very few opportunities for women. Why? Because it would not be permissible for a young woman to go live with a male teacher. Also, women would not be permitted to be trained in figure studies because to study the human body, you would often look at nudes or cadavers, and that was considered taboo for women's delicate sensibilities. Now, there were women artists at this time, but most were either trained by their fathers or their husbands. Also, interestingly enough, if a male artist had his own workshop, if he died, a woman could inherit her husband's workshop, but she was not permitted to run it. All right, well then continuing on with this idea, here we're going to look at some later Flemish painters. And this is, when we talk about this, we're talking about the second generation of Flemish artists who were active in the later half of the 15th century. We're going to continue to see the use of oil paints to help create naturalistic representations. And we see that in the work here. This is Petrus Christus, circa 1410 to 1472, a goldsmith in his shop, 1449, oil on wood. And this is what we call a vocational painting. So it is actually focusing on the job of a goldsmith. Here what we see is we see the goldsmith sitting, and then it shows Saint Agalus, who was a goldsmith himself before committing his life to God. And he was the patron saint of gold and silversmiths. And what we see here is we see a scene where the woman is buying wedding rings. Historically, this is very credible to what a true goldsmith's office would look like. We see a variety of objects that serve as an advertisement for the Goldsmiths Guild. This includes the goldsmith's raw materials such as precious stones, beads, crystals, coral, and seed pearls. And then we also see different finished products, rings, buckles, and brooches lying around. And then all of this is used to enhance the naturalism of the painting. And we're going to see some of that continued in this work. This is Derek Bout's circa 1415 to 1475. This is his version of The Last Supper, 1464 to 1468, and it's an oil on wood. Now this was the central panel of the altarpiece for the Holy Sacrament. This is one of the earliest Northern Renaissance paintings to employ linear perspective and a vanishing point to create an illusion of depth. In linear perspectives, if you remember, this is how we attempt to show that three-dimensionality by uses of at least two lines that recede into the distance to a vanishing point. Think of it as, train tracks where we see them going away from us. They slowly move more towards each other. And we know that's supposed to show that the objects are further back. And we see that here. Now, there's not a clear line, but we definitely have this implied line created by the two walls. The vanishing point is pretty much right above Christ's head. And so we know if we were standing in this room that Christ and the door are going to be the furthest away from us. Okay? And this also shows a different Last Supper scene than is usually seen. If you look, the story in the Last Supper is where Jesus broke the bread and the wine and said, "This is my body, this is my blood." And this became the ritual of the Eucharist. However, look at this painting here. He's not holding bread, he's actually holding the Eucharist wafer. And so what happens in this painting is it's actually showing the ritual within the church. So this was not a realistic depiction because according to the text, the Last Supper, Jesus had bread, not the Eucharist wafer. And also what we see here, again, realistic details. If you look at the tiled floor, all of these details, again, add to the naturalism. And then there are also in here 4 members of the confraternity who commissioned the work. The 2 figures who are standing, the one on the right, and then we see the one on the left, and then the 2 figures who are looking through the window. These would be members of the confraternity who had commissioned the work. All right, next we're going to look at this work by Hugo van der Goes, circa 1440 to 1482. And this is the Portarni Altarpiece. And this was a work in a family chapel, and it was actually located in Florence, Italy. Now, this was a triptych. Again, you can see there's the 3 separate paintings. And it was painted for Tommaso Portini, who was an Italian ship owner. And in the wings, in the left and right panels, we actually see he appears with his family. The central panel is the Adoration of the Shepherds, but it is much different than other ones we've seen. In other adorations of the shepherds, usually we either see Mary holding the baby Jesus or we see the baby Jesus in the manger. Well, here, if you look, the baby is actually laying on the ground, and Mary is also joining in the adoration. We also see these attempts at 3-dimensionality, but in the center panel it's a little off. It's almost as if the ground is tilted a little bit, and the reason the artist did this was so we could get the clear view of the baby on the ground. Also, the architecture in the wintry weather shows us that this has probably taken place in Northern Europe, and the same landscape is in all 3 of the panels, and it tends to help unify the work. The work is also very full of symbols. We have the iris and the columbine flowers, which are, again, meant to represent the sorrows of the Virgin. We see a sheaf of wheat, and that actually stands for the city of Bethlehem. Bethlehem means the house of bread in Hebrew. And it's also a reference to, again, the Eucharist that we just talked about, the breaking of the bread. Also, you can look throughout this, there are different small scenes showing different biblical references in the background. These include the journey of Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, the Annunciation to the shepherds, and the arrival of the Magi. Again, this work is very, very religious in its meaning, but it's also very realistic. All right, well now we're going to shift our focus to France. And again, as I mentioned earlier, most of France is still involved in the 100 Years' War. And this did cripple the economic enterprise, and often it did prevent political stability in France at the time. Because of this, we're going to see the rise of the duchies, which are areas that were controlled by a duke. So they were almost like small little central areas of government. What we're also going to see at this time, though, is we're going to see more develops in manuscript painting, meaning paintings that were part of a text. Here we're going to see that these were built on the achievements of Gothic painters. Remember the Gothic architecture, and that was very strong in France. However, we are going to see again within this rise of naturalism and trying to show the world as it realistically is. And so we're going to see this new connection and presentation of space. And you see that in the work you see here. This was created by the Limbourg brothers, who were Paul, Herman, and Jean, and they all died in 1416, very likely from the plague. And what this is actually a page from the Book of Hours. The translation is the very sumptuous hours of the Duke of Berry. And this is a page from October, 1413 to 1416, and it's colors and ink on vellum. What a Book of Hours was, or still is, it's a book for reciting daily prayers. And these Book of Hours became favorite possessions of those in Northern Europe, especially with the aristocracy during the 14th and 15th century. And again, here we see shown, it's a full page calendar picture for October. At the top here, you can see above each picture, and this is true for all of the calendar, you see a lunette showing the zodiac times of that sign. So in this one, if you look on the right, we see Scorpio. And we actually see the chariot of the sun. That's in the center semicircle. And it's a chariot of the sun as it makes its yearly cycle through the heavens. Now you have to remember, we are still living in a geocentric world. There's still the idea that the earth is the center, and it's the sun that revolves around the earth. So that's why the sun is the object moving. And then each picture in this calendar actually shows the good life under the Duke. The other one in your textbook focuses on kind of a festival he's having for the people. Well, here, this one actually focuses on the peasantry. Here we see a sower in the fields planting the seeds. There's a man plowing. In the midground, we see a washerwoman. And then we see the city dwellers walking in front of the Louvre, which this is the Louvre of today. But this was where the French king lived at the time. Now it's a museum. Also, we see in here this interest in naturalism. We see these clear architectural details, the use of atmospheric perspective, and what's very interesting here is if we look at the shadows, we actually see the shadows of the people and objects in this work. And this is, excuse me, this is one of the first times that we really see this correct use of shadows within a work. Now, what's interesting, this book, it is a book of hours, but it's both a combination of religious and secular concerns and what's called the genre subjects. These genre subjects are subjects of just everyday life. And the brothers, as they created these works, actually treated the illustrations as if they were almost windows into the world of the 15th century Europe. All right, here what we see, this is from the Master of Mary of Burgundy. We actually don't know who this artist is. It's an anonymous illuminator, and so they're just known as the Master of Mary of Burgundy. Why? Because this was a book of hours that belonged to Mary, the last Duchess of Burgundy. Here what we see, this is a full page illumination, and it was one of the daily prayers in the private devotional of her Book of Hours. On the left hand, we see Mary the Duchess in the foreground holding a book, probably meant to be this exact Book of Hours, and so she's reading and she's praying. She has her dog on her lap, and if you look on the bench there, you see her rosary beads. And so through this, we see her praying, and then when we look through the window, what we see through the window is actually her prayer being answered. She is kneeling before the Virgin Mary, who has the infant Jesus with her. And with this, what makes this so interesting is this very realistic use of details and perspective. We can see the two Marys are actually within a Gothic church. All right, other developments at this time is we're going to see the development of more panel paintings. And what panel paintings are independent paintings that became very popular. Often these were used for private devotional use, and the preferred medium of these were oil paint on wood panels. And here we see two of these panel paintings. These were by Jean Foucault, 1425 to 1478. And this is what's called the melon diptych. So a triptych is 3, a diptych is 2. These are 1452, oil on wood. And what we see here on the left wing is we see Antenne Chevalier and Saint Stephen. And so this was commissioned by Chevalier. He was actually the royal treasurer in 1452 for Charles VII. Here he's shown with his patron saint, Saint Stephen. We know it's him. He was martyred by stoning, and here he actually is holding the stone. And here you see this very clear, meticulous detailing within the work. Now, these two works were originally shown together. I believe they are separate now. And if you follow the gaze of both of the men in this, it directs your eyes to the right-hand panel. Yet this one is very interesting because it's very different from ones we've seen before. This is the Virgin and Child, but they're shown in almost a very unusual way. Mary herself has very cold, almost marble-like flesh. Same thing that with the baby Jesus, very cold, almost seems to be stone. And then they're surrounded by these very bold red and blue cherubs. Now, Mary is shown with her left breast exposed, presumably to nurse the baby. Now, this is a rare subject, Mary actually nursing the baby, but we've seen it before. It's not unheard of. But here, it doesn't really seem as if she's there to nurse. It's shown in a most unusual way. Mary doesn't even look at the baby or the viewer. They seem almost unattached to each other. And what was interesting was the model for Mary was actually Agnes Sorel, and she had been the mistress to King Charles VII. The work was commissioned after her death. The rumor is she probably died from poisoning while she was pregnant with the king's child. Interesting, though, she had already given birth to 3 of his daughters, but she was poisoned, probably with the fear that she was going to have a male son, which would become the heir. And so within this work, it's not just the religious meaning, but because of this and using her as the model, it also becomes somewhat political in nature. But it's just a very interesting work because it's a very different depiction of the Virgin and Child than we've seen before. All right, now we're going to switch to the Holy Roman Empire. And so this area, the core of it is what is modern day Germany. Now, this area did not participate in the Hundred Years' War, so the economy remained stable and prosperous. Here again, we're going to see wealthy merchants and clergy become the primary German art patrons during the 15th century. Now, what makes this interesting? Within the other areas, we saw very clear, distinct styles. But in the Holy Roman Empire, there's not one single style. We're going to see these works are very diverse, and so we're going to look at a few of these. First, what we see here, this is by Conrad Witz, circa 1400 to 1446, and this is the Miraculous Draught of Fish, 1444, oil on wood. This is the exterior wing of the altarpiece of St. Peter from the chapel of Notre Dame de Macabre, which is the Cathedral of St. Peter within Geneva, Switzerland. Here it shows Peter, the first pope, unsuccessfully trying to emulate Christ walking on water. So he's actually the guy in the water, the man in the red robe with the halo, that's Christ watching on. Now, what makes this work so important is the realistic details in the landscape and the water. If you look with his use of water, you can see the reflection of the men in the boat. You can see the reflection of the light. And even when you look at the shallow depths of the water, think of when you're standing on, shallow water, you can see into the depths. And he captures that all very realistically within the work. Also, what's so very interesting in this is he realistically depicted the landscape and the horizon that historians are actually able to determine the exact location this painting took place. And it's on the shores of Lake Geneva with the town of Geneva on the right, and we see Le Mont Mountain in the distance. So this works so naturalistic, so realistic, we can tell exactly where the painter painted it. All right, next we're going to look at sculpture. What we see here, this is the altarpiece in the Holy Roman Empire. Usually these tended to be very large carved wood. Often they showed the continued influence of the Gothic style. And we're going to see that in this work here. This is Vet Stas, circa 1447, 1533. This actually, he settled in Krakow, which is in present-day Poland. And this is Death and the Assumption of the Virgin, 1477, 1489. Death and Assumption of the Virgin is where Mary dies and she goes up into heaven. And so you can see in the center of the center panel, she is standing there with Jesus and she's about to go up into heaven. What this work is carved and then it's painted and gilded lime wood. Now the central panel is very, very large. It's actually 23 feet 9 inches high. Here we have the wings open, and then this was the central panel for the altarpiece of the Virgin Mary in the Church of St. Mary in Krakow, Poland. And again here, throughout this, it portrays scenes from the lives of Christ and Mary, and it shows the intense piety of the Gothic culture. Also, these are used to heighten the emotion and to glorify the sacred elements. Here we do see the striving for realism in the work. If you look, we again see the different emotions, the different individualistic characters of each of the people who are represented in this. And then what unifies the work is in each panel we see these different elements from Gothic architecture. And so this unifies the entire work. And so what we see here, it's not just a sculpture, it actually merges sculpture and architecture together. All All right, finally, we're going to look at the graphic arts, and we're going to talk about some of the technological advances that were made during this time. Very important, around 1450, Johann Gutenberg, his date circa 1400 to 1468, created the movable type. And what this is the development of the printing press. And with the movable type, you didn't have to create just one big sheet, but you could have the small individual letters, and you could move them around. Because of this, you could literally create something, print it, create something else from it. And because of this, and with the invention, eventually to using paper that is created from wood pulp like we use today, not quite there yet, but books become much cheaper and much more readily available to more individuals. Because of this, we're going to see a rise in literacy, and the improved economics also made this so people wanted more books. Well, what happens is a lot of these books would also be illustrated. And what you see here, this is a page from the Nuremberg Chronicles. And what the Nuremberg Chronicles is it was actually one of the first attempts to write the history of the world. Interestingly enough, if you ever want to see a copy, the University of Louisville, their rare books and special collections actually has this text. You can go look at it. And at the end, they left 9 blank pages. And the 9 blank pages were meant so you could record the rest of human history. But what we see here is this was actually illustrated by a woodcut. And why these were so popular is multiple prints could be made cheaper and quickly and cheaply. And what happens here, again, this is Michael Vollmont's in Workshop, a page from the Nuremberg Chronicle, 1493. And this is what the woodcut is. It's what's called a relief method of printing, meaning that say you have a block of wood, and the area that you want to be printed remains. So anything that you don't want to be printed, you actually have to, scrape it out, to groove it out. Then the top is inked, and then it is printed. So what happens here is the artist actually has to work in the negative. Think of a rubber stamp. This is what a relief is. So when you have a rubber stamp, you ink the top. That's what is printed. The same is true for a woodcut. Now within woodcut, it is very difficult to create very thin, fluid, or closely spaced lines. You usually have very harsh outlines and a lot of empty spaces in it. So it leaves the works to be not very realistic. So we can look here, and we know that this is supposed to be a city, but it's not an accurate representation of the city. Well, what ends up happening is we move from woodcuts into what's called engraving. This is by Martin Schulger, his date circa 1430 to 1491. And what happens in engraving is that it's much more flexible than woodcut. And this is what's called the intaglio process. And so what happens in this is that lines are actually etched into a surface, usually a metal plate. There's various processes that can happen, but sometimes they're put in acid baths and all that. But basically, you have the grooves inside a plate. Then ink is forced into the grooves, and then a press is used to take that ink and transfer it onto paper. Now here with the intaglio process, which engraving is one of those, you can get a lot clearer details. You can get greater detail, you can get more shading, you can get much softer images. And you can see that clearly by looking at this work and comparing it to the other one. These are distinctly different. And this is St. Anthony Tormented by Demons, circa 1480. And what happens is prints are going to become much more popular. Why? They're printed on paper, so they become much more portable. You can also produce numerous prints from one single plate. Because of this, they were often sold at lower prices, and they became much more available to a much larger audience. So we're going to start to see this shift during that time period. All right, well, that is the end of chapter 20.